For a long time, Muslims have claimed that the Quran has specific scientific knowledge about a variety of topics. This is allegedly evidence for divine inspiration of Muhammad's revelations, since he could not have known these things at the time of recitation. But does the Quran actually contain scientific miracles that could not have been known at the time? Let's examine most of the claims. I say most because there are still new ones being made, and so as of this presentation, there might be more claims made in the future. First up is the date stock. In Surah Yasin, which is the 36th Surah, Ayat 39, the claim is made that the path of the moon travels as an old date or palm stalk. Muslims today have claimed that this is proof of divine revelation, because scientists have only recently charted the path of the moon and found it to be similar to the way of an old date stalk. However, that's not new knowledge. Several Mesopotamian cultures used the movement of the moon to create their calendars, and the kicker, they were doing this 4,000 years before Muhammad. All Muhammad would have to know in order to make this statement is what everybody in the region had known for millennia. What's even better is that in this context, the ayat does not seem to be stating anything unorthodox. The surrounding verses talk about how night and day cannot exist at the same time, which, as you'll notice, is literally mentioned in the first chapter of Genesis, which comes about 2,000 years before Muhammad. But there is actually another scientific miracle that was written down before Muhammad's time, and you'll never guess where it was. The claim about the division of the waters found in Surah 25, Ayat 53, is Allah saying that He is the one who divides the waters between salt and fresh water. He even places a barrier between them so that they cannot mix. And what do you know? When initially placed in the same container, salt and fresh water do not mix. Almost like there's a barrier between them. Except they do mix. It's called brackish water. It happens very slowly, but eventually salt and fresh water mix to become brackish water, which is water that is too salty to be fresh water, but doesn't have enough salt content to be considered salt water. What is true of salt and fresh water is that they do not have a shared natural source. Estuaries form when bodies of fresh and salt water come together to form brackish water. However, they do not share a spring, which is in fact what James 3:11 says. James is of course written several hundred years before Muhammad, and thus, by Muslim logic, the Epistle of James is divinely inspired, which it is. So at least they got that right. Of course, many cultures understood salt and freshwater springs, and knew that the two did not share a source. This is in no way impossible knowledge. Okay, so maybe something other than water can be accurate? Well, how about the Islamic claim about the roots of the mountains? In Surah 78, An-Naba, Ayat 6 and 7, the Quran talks about how the mountains are the pegs of the earth, meaning they reach to the foundation and hold it in place. And to this point, geologists have discovered that mountains do in fact have deep roots. But this is not a new idea that the Quran came up with. In the book of Jonah, specifically Jonah 2:6, the prophet cries out that he is in the place of the roots of the mountains. Job, in chapter 28, speaks of mountain roots, and so does David in the Psalms. It was absolutely a common idea that mountains had deep roots, but that's not the only surah that mentions mountains and their depths. Surah 16, An-Nahl, Ayat 15, talks about how the mountains are placed to prevent earthquakes, right? It says that the mountains are placed so that the earth does not shake for the people in the Quran. The only problem is mountains are a result of the tectonic plate shifting, which causes earthquakes. Mountains are caused by earthquakes in a way, right? More so the collision of tectonic plates, which forms mountains. Absolutely, they are not holding the ground steady. They are a result of ground instability. So, can't find anything on Earth. Maybe we need to look outside of the Earth to get Quranic scientific insight. Let's talk about the Big Bang. Surah 21, Al-Anbiya, Ayat 30. Allah says that the heavens and the earth were once one substance, and He separated them. Muslims take this to mean the Big Bang, which is the scientific discovery in the 19th century that the universe did in fact have a beginning. However, that interpretation is doing a lot of legwork. All Allah says is that He separated the matter. He mentions nothing about creating the matter here. And that is what the Big Bang was, the point of creation where all of matter comes into existence. It has nothing to do with separation. This passage would more accurately be a reworking of Genesis 1, 6 through 9, which Muhammad would know if he listened to the last 2 lectures that Josh gave. Staying with this ayat, Allah also says that He brought life out of water. Muslims have taken this to agree with the idea that life began with water and eventually evolved to live on land. Whatever your beliefs concerning macroevolution, this is not the claim the Quran is making. What Muhammad is instead saying is what Greek scientists and philosophers like Aristotle were saying several hundred years earlier, that water is the central aspect for all life. Maybe, though, we can find a claim that isn't in the Bible, and that will help us determine that the Quran is divinely inspired. So let's talk about some iron. In Surah 57 Al-Hadid, which means the iron, Ayat 25, Allah says that He sent down iron from heaven to be a tool for humanity. We now know that meteorites containing iron have crashed into the earth, and so clearly the Quran had this divine insight. Unfortunately for Islam, ancient Egyptians and Babylonians both believed something similar and called iron the metal of heaven. One last try. This time, we have a claim not found in the Bible or by any other ancient peoples. Surely, this will prove even the smallest modicum of divine inspiration. Let's talk about the layers of the ocean. In Surah 24, Nur, Ayat 40, the Quran says that there are layers of waves and darkness in the water so that people could not see. Scientists discovered within the last 200 years that there are, in fact, layers of ocean currents that divide the ocean up into 3 sections, which are called a lot of big scientific words that I can't pronounce. Thankfully, for us Cretans, they gave them simpler names. They are known as the surface, the twilight zone, and the deep. No other ancient culture that I could find made a similar claim to this. And this type of claim is not in the Bible. So finally, the Quran has done it. It has found the scientific miracle. Let's read the ayat in celebration. Surah 24, ayat 40. Or their deeds like the darkness in a deep sea, covered by waves upon waves, topped by dark clouds, darkness upon darkness. If one stretches out their hand, they can hardly see it, and whoever God does not bless with the light will have no light. Something didn't sound right there, right? So it says waves upon waves, and we know that's literal and physical, but it also says darkness upon darkness. Are there physical layers of darkness from the ocean? If I swam from the surface into the twilight, would I suddenly not be able to see? I also would never do that. I don't mess with the deep ocean stuff. That freaks me out. Full transparency. But of course not. That wouldn't make any sense. So the layers of darkness would be figurative. But why then do we interpret the waves as literal and the darkness as figurative? We can't just cherry pick and decide that one portion of the verse is literal and another portion of the verse is figurative. Either there are layers of darkness, like actual darkness, and they're layered, or the layers of waves is just to say there's a lot of water, which actually is a fairly common idiom, at least today. And something kind of funny, while researching for this claim, I actually found a Japanese comic book titled Waves Upon Waves. I don't know anything about it. I've never read it. I just found it doing this. But if I am to apply the same level of scrutiny that Muslims apply to this ayat, then the Japanese comic book is the word of Allah. All ham to Allah. My point is, the inconsistency with which you pick what you take literally and what you take figuratively within the same sentence cannot be a valid metric for interpretation. Ali Dawah admits the scientific miracles argument has been completely debunked. What's funny is he brushes it off by saying people are flocking to Islam. But a survey of 13 countries by Pew Research found that only one country had positive growth for Islam, being Malaysia, and that was a single percentage point of positive growth. All other countries either had neutral, no gain, or they were losing Muslims. The truth is, Islam is drastically shrinking in the West, and that means we should push all the harder now because we have a very unique opportunity here. And to push like that has to start with knowing their arguments, even if they have been debunked. Because a lot of Muslims still use the scientific arguments. These claims about scientific knowledge in the Quran are so ingrained in the DNA of dawah that after one of their biggest leaders admits they can't use the argument anymore, people still do it. We have to understand that when you're witnessing to Muslims, we are witnessing to people who have fully bought into the lies that have been told to them. We have to have grace and mercy and kindness because these are people who have built their lives upon a complete and total lie and do not understand that. But what I find most troubling is the fact that they are willing to overlook the scientific inaccuracies. I think that's symptomatic of the greater disease of Islam, which is the willingness to not ask questions. I want to take a look at a few examples of scientific inaccuracies to kind of get at the point which I'm talking about. So the first example I'd like to look at is in reference to embryology. Initially, the Quran was touted for being way ahead of its time when describing embryology. This collapsed quickly, however, upon learning that Aristotle and Galen, a Greek scientist, both wrote on embryonic development, and Galen specifically on the development of bones. This is important because the Quran gets the description of how a child develops in the womb drastically wrong hundreds of years after the Greek scientists got it not completely right, but a lot closer. Surah 23, Al-Muminun, ayat 12 through 14, describes the creation of Adam as being from clay, and then Allah dropped some sperm into the clay, formed the sperm into a blood clot, then the blood clot into flesh, flesh into bones, and covered those bones with more flesh. Lastly, he breathed life into Adam. This is obviously not how human beings are made, and any middle school science textbook can tell you that. Some might object and say that this is specific to Adam. But why should we think that outside of the clay creation process? The Islamic scholars certainly did not think this way, as they used this ayat to justify abortion up to 120 days. By their logic, Allah only breathes life after 40 days in the mother as sperm, 40 days as a clot, and then 40 days as a lump of flesh. But that is, unfortunately for Islam, not the only thing the Quran gets wrong about human physiology. Now, obviously, we have had great developments in scientific understanding of the human embryo and how the child develops. And we know that life begins at conception, just biologically. And that's not a theological or moral position. That is purely a scientific one. So we know that life doesn't start after 120 days in the womb. And we also know that you do not spend 40 days as sperm, then 40 days as a blood clot, then 40 days as a lump of flesh. From the time of fertilization, at no point are you any of those things, really. You are never sperm, right? Because if you fertilize an egg, it's not just the sperm, it is a fertilized egg at that point, right? It is a zygote, it is not sperm. Actually, I guess it's a blastocyte. You are a blastocyte, you are not sperm. And then you are certainly never a blood clot. That is just very inaccurate description. And then we know now, thanks to science, that bones and flesh develop at the same time. You are never just this lump of flesh that then hardens into bone. That doesn't make any sense and is certainly not accurate. But that's not the only thing that the Quran gets wrong about human physiology. In Surah 86, At-Tariq, ayat 5 through 7, Allah describes the place where the life fluid, which creates people, comes from. And since we are all adults here, I don't think I have to clarify precisely what this life fluid is. The issue here is that Allah, the alleged God of the universe and creator of mankind, states that the life fluid comes from between the backbone and the ribs. Right about there. As any 7th grader in health class will tell you, that is not where the fluid that creates people comes from. Some try to excuse it by saying that the passage is talking about prepubescent boys whose testes have not dropped. But that cannot be, since undescended testes do not produce semen. And now that I've gotten to write and speak the phrase undescended testes, I'd like to move on to our final problem that I'll address scientifically, that being cosmology. In Surah 67, Al-Mulk, Ayat 5, Allah reveals to Muhammad that shooting stars are in fact missiles that he sends to hit demons trying to eavesdrop on the plans of heaven. No, I'm not making that up. Yes, the Quran really says that Allah and the jinn, which is the Islamic word for demons, are playing cosmic battleship. And what's even better is that the Quran manages to double down on this claim in Surah 72, which is Al-Jinn, Ayat 8, when the demons found it, quote, filled with stern guards and shooting stars. Now, for those who aren't illiterate 7th century warlords, shooting stars are not, in fact, God's equivalent of the fat man and the little boy. The bombs, not the movie. Instead, they are comets, which are burning up upon coming into the gravitational field of Earth. So I firmly believe that we have established that the Quran is, in fact, unscientific in every facet.